My name is Elara. I am 24 years old, and all my life I was treated like a stranger in my own home. My father was one of the richest men in the city. His businesses spread across continents. His name feared and respected. But to him I was invisible. A daughter born from the wrong woman. A reminder of a scandal he wanted buried. He gave his love, his empire, and his power to my stepmother and her perfect golden children, while I was left with scraps, raised in silence, as if I were nothing but an unwanted shadow. I watched as my half-sister flaunted diamonds bought with the fortune that should have been partly mine, and my half-brother was trained to inherit the empire while I was kept locked away, told I had no place at the table. But shadows are patient, and silence is a weapon. While they bathed in arrogance, I learned to see their weaknesses, their greed, their lust for control. They thought I was forgotten, harmless, powerless. But deep inside me, a fire was waiting, a vow burning that one day I would take back everything they denied me. And when that day came, they would understand that the forgotten daughter is the one they should have feared all along. For years I had lived like a ghost in that mansion, drifting past golden hallways and glass chandeliers that reflected wealth. I was never allowed to touch, but ghosts see what the living do not, and in their arrogance my stepmother and her children never realized how carefully I was watching. My stepmother, Helena, loved to flaunt her control. Every night she hosted dinners for the city's elite, weaving her charm like a venomous spider, making allies and cutting enemies with a single smile. My half-brother Adrian was already drunk, on the illusion of power, practicing speeches in front of mirrors about how he would expand the empire, while my half-sister Celeste indulged in luxury, her days drowned in jewels, perfumes, and men who bowed at her feet. To them, I was no more than the quiet girl sitting at the far end of the table, someone they didn't need to notice, a mistake my father allowed to remain under his roof out of guilt. But invisibility was my greatest weapon. I began small, so small they couldn't see my hand, switching Adrian's reports before a business meeting so that he presented false numbers and looked like a fool in front of the investors, whispering the right secrets in Celeste's social circle until her most trusted friends began to doubt her loyalty, planting just enough evidence to make Helena paranoid that someone in her own circle was betraying her. They thought it was bad luck, or coincidence, or petty rivalries tearing them apart. But it was me, weaving cracks into the empire they believed untouchable. Each move was calculated, each result was deliberate, and as I watched them argue, accuse, and stumble, I felt the quiet thrill of power rushing through my veins for the first time. They had left me with nothing but shadows, and from those shadows I was building the storm that would destroy them. Adrian had always believed that leadership was his birthright, strutting around with the arrogance of a prince waiting for his crown. But what he lacked in vision he compensated for with cruelty, and that arrogance became the perfect weapon for me to exploit. For months, I studied his every move, the late-night calls to his mistresses, the forged reports he used to impress investors, the desperate loans he took under secret identities to fund his gambling habits, and the arrogance with which he believed no one could ever uncover the truth. He was reckless, and recklessness always leaves trails. One night, when Helena was away charming yet another minister into her pocket, I slipped into Adrian's study and carefully replaced the original contracts in his files with duplicates. I had prepared, laced with just enough forged signatures and altered numbers to make it appear that Adrian himself had been stealing from the family accounts. I left subtle breadcrumbs, not enough to accuse him directly, but enough to plant the suspicion deep in the minds of the board members who already doubted him. At the same time, I fed whispers into the ears of those who envied his position, giving them just enough truth wrapped in lies to ignite their hunger. Soon, the Empire's boardroom, once united in blind loyalty to Helena, became a battlefield, with investors questioning Adrian's every decision and old allies beginning to withdraw their support. Adrian panicked, as I knew he would. He lashed out at Celeste, accusing her of plotting against him, while Helena raged at the board for daring to question her son's authority. The once pristine halls of our mansion were now filled with screams, broken glass, and slammed doors, and in the middle of their chaos, I remained silent, my head bowed, my footsteps quiet, my lips sealed. Because silence was my shield, and they never suspected the girl they ignored could be the one orchestrating their downfall. The cracks in their golden throne had begun to spread, and through those cracks, I could already glimpse the ruin that was coming. Celeste lived for attention. It was the very air she breathed, the gold she worshipped, the weapon she used to keep her throne in the city's glittering social circle. Her beauty was undeniable, her wardrobe dripping with the most extravagant gowns, her lips always painted in colors that could silence an entire room, and her laughter, sweet to the ears of men and venomous to the hearts of women, was her deadliest tool. But beauty without substance is fragile, and I knew if I could shatter her perfect mask, she would crumble faster than Adrian ever could. I began by stealing her secrets. In her vanity, Celeste trusted too many, spoke too freely, and believed her charm made her untouchable. I listened carefully to the whispers of her so-called friends. How she seduced the husband of a senator, how she betrayed a best friend for a necklace, how she lied about her wealth to maintain her image, and I gathered every detail like pearls on a string. Then, piece by piece, I leaked them into her world. A note left on the senator's wife's doorstep. A misplaced photograph slipped into the wrong hands. A hint to a journalist known for destroying reputations. Slowly, the whispers became storms. Invitations to the grand parties stopped arriving. Her name, once spoken with envy, was now laced with disgust. The women she once ruled turned their backs on her, and the men who worshipped her beauty sought fresher prey. Celeste tried to fight back, but every time she denied a rumor, I made sure another one surfaced, sharper and louder than the last. The mansion echoed with her sobs at night, her screams at Helena for not protecting her, and Helena's cold replies that her daughter should have been smarter. For the first time, the girl who had once spat at me from the staircase passed, by me in silence, her eyes red, her hair unkempt, her confidence shattered like broken glass on the marble floor, and though she still refused to look at me, I could feel her trembling, as if some shadow she couldn't see was tightening around her throat. That shadow was me, the forgotten daughter, the one they had dismissed as invisible. And now I was the storm ripping through their golden empire. Helena was a master manipulator, a woman who had built her empire not just on wealth but on fear, charm, and carefully woven alliances. Ministers adored her, businessmen bowed to her, and socialites whispered her name with reverence and terror. But every empire built on lies carries seeds of collapse, and I had begun watering those seeds long before she noticed. Her strength lay in her network, men and women who owed her favors, secrets she held against them, and debts she never allowed them to forget. But networks are fragile things, and all it takes is one loose thread to unravel the entire web. I started by tampering with her correspondence, small changes in her letters and emails that shifted meanings, twisted intentions, and created misunderstandings with her most loyal allies. Where once they saw her as a benefactor, they now began to question if she was turning against them. At the same time, I planted forged evidence that made it look as if Helena had leaked confidential details about a senator's affair and a businessman's hidden bankruptcy. Information only she could have known, information that made them feel betrayed. One by one, her allies began pulling away, no longer answering her calls, no longer sending her the gifts and favors that once flowed freely. Worse still, whispers began spreading that she was losing her edge, that her reign of control was slipping, that she was no longer the queen of influence she once had been. Helena's fury was volcanic. She stormed through the mansion like a tyrant, slapping servants, breaking vases, screaming at Adrian and Celeste for being weak distractions, demanding loyalty from people who were already planning to abandon her. Yet in her paranoia, she never suspected me, the quiet daughter in the corner, the shadow slipping unnoticed through her halls. She thought the betrayal came from outside, from enemies who wanted her throne, never realizing that the poison was inside her house, growing stronger with each passing day. And as she raged, as she fought to hold together the web that was unraveling in her hands, I stood in silence, my heart calm, because for the first time in years, Helena was no longer untouchable. For so long, I had existed only in the periphery of their lives. A shadow in silk dresses, a silent figure at the edge of their golden feasts. But the more Helena's grip slipped, the bolder I became, until finally the time came to step out of the shadows. Not fully, not enough for them to see the knife in my hand, but enough to let them feel its sharp edge against their skin. The opportunity came during one of Helena's grand gatherings, when the mansion glittered with chandeliers and echoed with the laughter of politicians and socialites who had once worshipped her. That night, I wore a gown that shimmered like moonlight, not gaudy like Celeste's costumes, but quiet, elegant, dangerous in its simplicity. And for the first time, heads turned not because Helena demanded it, but because I demanded it without saying a word. I watched Adrian stumble through a drunken toast, his words slurred, his confidence crumbling, while Celeste sulked in a corner, ignored by the very people who once adored her. Then came Helena, her smile stretched too thin, her charm cracking beneath the weight of suspicion, her allies exchanging whispers instead of praise. And in that silence, I moved. I whispered into the right ears, a senator's wife here, a merchant's daughter there, letting them believe I knew things about them I could never have known unless Helena herself had betrayed them. Their faces paled, their glances at Helena sharpened, and slowly, like smoke seeping into a room, mistrust began to spread. I even dared to stand close to Helena, close enough that when she turned to speak to a minister, she caught me watching with a gaze too calm, too knowing, and for the first time I saw it, the flicker of fear in her eyes. She didn't know why, didn't know how, but something in her gut told her that the silent daughter she had dismissed for years was no longer invisible. And though she forced a smile, though she tried to dismiss the unease clawing at her chest, I knew the truth. Helena had felt the first spark of fear, and once fear takes root, it grows like wildfire until even queens are left trembling in the ashes. Fear is the one enemy Helena had never prepared herself for, because she had always been the one who commanded it, never the one who felt it. But that night, as her carefully painted smile cracked beneath the chandeliers, I saw the shift. The subtle tightening of her jaw, the darting glance in my direction, the way her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. For the first time, Helena was not in control, and she knew it. I did not need to speak, did not need to raise my voice or call attention to myself, because silence had always been my greatest weapon, and in that silence her mind filled in the blanks with nightmares of betrayal she could not prove but could no longer ignore. The web she had spun for decades, binding ministers with debts, merchants with favors, and rivals with threats, was no longer taut and gleaming. It sagged under invisible weight, threads snapping one by one, and she could not see that I was the spider crawling closer every day. Adrian's drunken collapse had already stripped her of authority in the boardroom, and Celeste's fading glamour had made the family a laughingstock among socialites. Yet Helena clung to her crown with bloody fingers, whispering to herself that she could still command loyalty if she only tightened her grip. But the tighter she held, the more her allies slipped through her grasp. I fed the whispers, planting forged notes and overheard secrets into the right ears, making it appear as though Helena was selling out her allies for her own survival. Soon, every smile she received at her gatherings was hollow, every toast tinged with suspicion, every ally weighing the cost of betraying her before she betrayed them. And still, she looked at me sometimes, just for a heartbeat too long, as if her instincts screamed the truth her mind refused to accept. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the storm at her doorstep, the poison in her veins. And though she still thought she could fight, Helena had already lost. Fear had entered her heart, and fear, once planted, grows until it consumes everything. Celeste had always been Helena's glittering jewel, the daughter draped in silks and diamonds, paraded before the world as proof of their family's elegance and power. But a jewel is only beautiful so long as it catches the light, and I had already made sure the light no longer shone on her. Yet pride is a stubborn disease, and Celeste still clung to what little dignity she believed she had left, desperate to remind society that she was the golden princess, not the fading shadow she had become. When word spread of a private masquerade, hosted by one of the city's most influential families, Celeste seized upon it as her chance for redemption, planning her entrance with the desperation of a gambler betting their last coin. She ordered a gown dripping with jewels, hired musicians to follow her, and rehearsed her smile in the mirror until her lips cracked. What she didn't know was that I had already moved the pieces against her. Through whispers and forged invitations, I ensured that her scandals, the stolen lovers, the broken friendships, the debts she had hidden in Helena's accounts, would all surface that very night. As she swept into the ballroom, head high, mask gleaming, she believed the world was watching her with admiration. But in truth, they were waiting for her fall. The moment came when a senator's wife, face pale with fury, confronted her publicly, with a letter I had slipped into her hands, proof that Celeste had seduced her husband. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and before Celeste could deny it, another woman stepped forward with a photograph, one I had carefully placed to expose her betrayal of a trusted friend. The accusations spread like wildfire, voices rising, laughter, bubbling cruelly as Celeste's mask slipped, her beauty no longer a weapon, but a mockery. She tried to defend herself, to call them liars, but every denial was met with more evidence, more whispers, more disgust. By the end of the night, she was not the princess in silks, but a shattered doll, mascara streaking her cheeks as she fled the ballroom under a rain of scorn. Back in the mansion, Helena raged and Adrian sneered, but Celeste locked herself in, her room, her sobs echoing down the marble halls like music to my ears. Her throne in the social world was gone, her name smeared beyond repair, and though she still lived under the same roof, she was already nothing more than a broken ornament, gathering dust. Helena was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had crawled through fire and blood to build her throne, and though her empire was collapsing piece by piece, she still clung to the belief that one bold move could restore her reign. In her desperation, she summoned what remained of her allies to the mansion for a private gathering, promising them protection, wealth, and secrets that could save their careers if only they stood by her side. She dressed in her most commanding attire, a gown of black velvet, jewels heavy around her neck. Her smile sharpened into a blade meant to remind them that she was still the queen who had once ruled them all. But I had already poisoned the roots of her empire, and this gathering was not a show of strength, but a funeral for her power. Hours before the meeting, I slipped forged documents into her study, papers suggesting Helena had been secretly selling her allies' secrets to their enemies for years. Then I ensured that these same papers were accidentally discovered by one of her most suspicious ministers, a man already wavering in his loyalty. When Helena rose to address the room, her voice thick with pride, the minister slammed the documents onto the table for all to see. Gasps filled the air, allies turned pale, and whispers rose into shouts. Helena tried to defend herself, tried to claim the evidence was fake, but her words fell on deaf ears, for every man and woman in that room had already felt the sting of betrayal from her in the past. They did not need proof to believe she was capable of treachery. The meeting descended into chaos, her allies storming out one by one, until Helena was left standing in the grand hall, her face flushed with fury, her crown of influence shattered. I watched from the balcony above, unseen, my hands folded calmly, as the queen I had once feared now stood alone, her empire slipping through her fingers like sand. And though she still carried herself with the posture of royalty, I could see it in her eyes. The first glimmer of defeat. The dawning realization that the poison was not outside her gates, but inside her very home. Helena had always trusted her instincts, the sharp animal sense that had guided her rise from a powerless widow to the iron-fisted queen of an empire. But instincts without proof are fragile things, and for the first time in her life, Helena could not separate paranoia from truth. She paced the marble halls at night, her heels clicking like war drums, her eyes wild as she demanded answers from servants, guards, even her own children. Adrian insisted their enemies outside the family were orchestrating her downfall. Celeste, still drowning in shame, muttered that jealous rivals had destroyed her, but Helena was not convinced. Again and again, her gaze fell on me, the quiet daughter who lingered in shadows, whose silence had become too sharp, whose eyes no longer held the dull submission of the past, but a calmness she could not explain. She watched me at dinners, her fork frozen in midair as she studied the way I sat, composed and unshaken, while her own family unraveled around her. She began testing me, slipping questions into casual conversations, planting false information, to see if it returned to her ears. But every time, I played the part of the obedient ghost, offering nothing, leaving no trail, watching as her frustration grew like wildfire in a dry forest. She even searched my room one night, ripping through drawers and closets, convinced she would find the knife hidden in my hands, but I had prepared for this long before. All she found was dust and silence, the kind of emptiness that mocked her desperation. Yet still, her suspicion would not leave her, and the fear I had planted now lived in her eyes every time they met mine. She could not accuse me, not without proof, not without exposing her own weakness, but she could not ignore me either. For the first time in her reign, Helena, the great manipulator, was trapped in her own web, and I, the invisible daughter, was the spider she could not catch. Helena had been cornered before in her rise to power, and she had survived by turning suspicion into strategy. So when her instincts screamed that I was the poison rotting her empire, she decided to lay a trap, sharp enough to expose me. She announced a new alliance with a wealthy foreign investor, a man rumored to control shipping routes that could save our collapsing fortune, and she made sure I overheard every detail of the secret deal, the date, the amount, the promises. She wanted to see if the information would somehow leak, if the quiet daughter's silence was nothing but a mask. What Helena did not know was that I had been waiting for her to test me, and I was ready. That night, under the cover of darkness, I forged a series of letters bearing Helena's seal, letters that painted her as a traitor selling more than shipping routes, selling secrets of her allies, selling information about the city's ministers, selling whatever she could to secure her own throne. I made sure those letters reached the very foreign investor she thought she was wooing, and when the day of the grand signing came, Helena entered the gilded hall with her chin high, her son and daughter trailing behind her like broken ornaments. She expected applause, respect, the salvation of her empire, but instead she was met with cold silence and narrowed eyes. The investor stood, the forged letters in hand, his voice echoing through the room as he denounced her as a fraud, a liar, a woman who could not be trusted. Gasps erupted, accusations flew, and Helena's face blanched as she realized the trap she had set for me had become her own noose. Adrian shouted in defense, Celeste wept in shame, and the once proud queen of influence was dragged into yet another, public humiliation. This one more devastating than all the rest, because it was the allies she had clung to who now spat her name like venom. And in the corner, as always, I stood with calm eyes and folded hands, unseen but all-seeing. The ghost, daughter who had turned Helena's own suspicion into the blade that cut her deepest. The moment we stepped through the golden doors, Helena's mask shattered. She slapped Adrian so hard he fell against the marble pillar, her voice a shriek of venom about his drunken incompetence, his weakness, his failure to be the son she needed. Celeste tried to intervene, but Helena turned on her too, yanking her by the hair, spitting words about her vanity, her worthlessness, her desperate need for attention that only dragged the family deeper into shame. The servants froze in horror, but no one dared move. No one dared speak, because Helena's wrath was legendary, and tonight it was boundless. For hours, the mansion echoed with her fury, the sound of breaking glass, the sobs of her children, the roars of a woman who knew her empire was slipping away grain by grain. Yet beneath the rage, I saw something else: fear. The cracks in her crown were no longer invisible, and Helena knew it. She was losing control, not just over her allies, not just over her empire, but over her own blood. And the more she lashed out, the more she revealed what she had tried to hide her entire life, that beneath the silk gowns and jeweled words, Helena was terrified. And terror, once exposed, spreads faster than fire. The days that followed were colder than winter, not because of the weather, but because of the silence that spread through Helena's mansion. Servants who once trembled at her footsteps now moved like ghosts, obeying her commands with blank faces, eyes lowered not out of respect, but out of quiet defiance. They whispered in the kitchens, in the corridors, their voices carrying rumors Helena could not kill. Rumors of her weakness, her paranoia, her empire rotting from within. Ministers who once flooded her halls with laughter and gifts stopped, visiting altogether, their excuses thin, their absence louder than any insult. Even Adrian and Celeste, her precious ornaments, had begun to shrink from her touch. Adrian drank more heavily, locking himself in his study, drowning in wine and self-pity. Celeste, once her mother's mirror, avoided her gaze, slipping out of rooms before Helena could call her name. For the first time, Helena was surrounded not by admiration, not by loyalty, but by emptiness. I moved quietly through it all, watching, waiting, adding only the smallest drops of poison to the well she had filled herself. A whisper here, a missing letter there, a glance at the right time. It was enough. The house no longer belonged to Helena. It belonged to the silence that grew thicker every day. The silence of people who no longer believed in her power, who no longer feared her enough to obey. And Helena, in her pride, could not see that silence was the loudest rebellion of all. Happened on an evening Helena had planned to reclaim her throne of influence. She ordered the chandeliers polished until they glistened like diamonds, the marble floors scrubbed until they reflected her image, the servants dressed in finer uniforms, as if perfection alone could disguise the rot beneath. Invitations had been sent to senators, businessmen, socialites, the very people whose loyalty she was desperate to win back. When they arrived, Helena descended the grand staircase in a gown of crimson silk, her jewels blazing under the lights. Her smile sharpened into something that looked like confidence but smelled of desperation. For a moment, she almost believed she could still command the room. But the air was wrong. Conversations dimmed as she passed. Laughter stalled, and eyes shifted not toward her, but toward one another with suspicion. She raised her glass to begin, a toast. Yet her voice trembled ever so slightly, and the tremor was enough. One of the ministers leaned away, whispering to his wife, and another guest chuckled under his breath, not with her, but at her. The cracks were showing, and once cracks appear, people stop seeing the queen. They start seeing the woman behind the mask. Helena's hand shook as she lifted her drink, the glass clinking louder than it should have. She tried to speak of power, of loyalty, of unity. But her words tangled on her tongue, her voice rising higher, shriller, as if she could drown out the doubts already echoing in the hall. Then, as she turned toward a senator who had once adored her, he looked her in the eye and simply walked away. The humiliation struck like a blade. Helena's face froze, her smile stretched into something grotesque, and before she could stop, herself. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eyes widened, whispers hissed, and Helena the untouchable, Helena the invincible, stood trembling, her crown of fear cracked wide open. And in that moment, as she searched the crowd for someone, anyone who would come to her defense, her gaze landed on me. I stood calm, unflinching, a faint smile playing at my lips, and I knew she understood. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but Helena finally knew who was unmaking her. Helena's downfall was no longer a whisper. It had become a storm that thundered through every corner of her empire. Ministers stopped returning her calls, businessmen withdrew their investments, and the socialites who once adored her parties now attended only to mock behind jeweled fans. But the cruelest betrayal came from within her own walls. Adrian, once her golden heir, began vanishing into nights of gambling and drunkenness, squandering the remnants of their wealth, while rumors spread that he was leaking family secrets for money. Celeste, desperate to cling to fading beauty and lost attention, turned venomous against her own mother, accusing Helena of sabotaging her prospects, of deliberately destroying her chances to marry into power. Their fights echoed through the mansion like battles between jackals, words turning to slaps, slaps turning to screams, and Helena stood in the middle, her iron grip slipping as her children tore at each other like starving wolves. Servants who had once bowed at her feet now averted their eyes, whispering of curses, of retribution, of a queen who had lost her blessing. I watched it all, silent and patient, the spider at the heart of the unraveling web. Every scream, every broken glass, every slammed door was a victory, proof that the empire Helena had built on fear was now feeding on itself. And the best part? She still couldn't bring herself to accuse me. Not out loud, not even to herself. But in the sleepless hours of the night, when the halls creaked and shadows stretched long, I saw it in her eyes. She knew. She knew that. I was the poison, that I was the shadow pulling the strings. But by then, it was too late. The mighty Helena, once untouchable, was trapped in a prison of her own making, betrayed by the very children she had raised into monsters, abandoned by the allies she had enslaved with secrets, and haunted by the silent daughter who had risen from the ashes to watch her burn. The mansion no longer glowed like a palace, it groaned like a dying beast. Curtains that once shimmered with imported silk now hung heavy with dust. Chandeliers that had once dazzled guests flickered with uneven light. And the halls echoed not with music, but with slammed doors and bitter arguments. Helena roamed those corridors like a restless ghost, her once flawless gowns now wrinkled, her jewels worn as if to remind herself she still had power, though everyone could see she didn't. Adrian had stopped hiding his recklessness. Every night he stumbled back drunk, sometimes dragging women from the city into the house, laughing loudly as if daring Helena to scold him. Celeste had grown crueler, mocking her mother in front of the servants, sneering that Helena's reign was over, that her beauty was fading, that even her queen's mask could no longer hide the lines of fear etching across her face. The servants obeyed less and whispered more, emboldened by the collapse they witnessed daily. Once Helena had ruled with absolute command, now she screamed for hours only to be met with blank stares and quiet disobedience. And I, still the shadow, still the forgotten daughter, moved silently through the chaos, planting words where they would sting the most, watching carefully as the cracks widened. Sometimes I would slip notes beneath Adrian's door suggesting Celeste mocked him behind his back, or whisper to Celeste that Adrian planned to sell the last of the estate without her. They believed me without question, too blinded by their hatred for each other to see whose hand guided the fire. Helena tried to hold them together, but every attempt ended with her voice breaking, her hands trembling, her once unshakable aura crumbling into something pitiful. The house itself seemed to mock her. Every creak in the floorboards, every draft of wind through the broken windows, reminding her that her empire was rotting from within. And all the while, I watched with calm satisfaction, knowing the war was no longer mine to fight. The war was inside them now, and it would eat them alive. Helena was no longer the queen who terrified entire cities with a single word. She had become a prisoner of her own mind, devoured by suspicions that grew like weeds in her chest. I saw it in her eyes every time she looked at Adrian or Celeste. The warmth of a mother was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, as if she was weighing them like enemies on a battlefield. Her paranoia had reached a fever pitch. She locked her study at night, hid ledgers inside secret compartments in the library, and began carrying letters on her body instead of leaving them in her desk. But no amount of caution could protect her from the whispers I had carefully planted. When she overheard Adrian yelling about debts, I made sure she also heard a servant mention he was secretly planning to sell her assets. When Celeste mocked Helena's fading charm, I added fuel by suggesting Celeste had told the socialites Helena was losing her mind. Slowly, the poison I had been dripping became the only truth Helena believed. I caught her one evening in the drawing room, staring at Adrian as he laughed drunkenly with his friends, her nails digging crescents into her palms, her lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. Later, I found her in Celeste's chamber, standing silently by the window as Celeste slept, her face bathed in the pale light of the moon, her eyes dark and unreadable. She began dismissing servants one by one, convinced they were spies sent by her children. She replaced trusted advisors with strangers who owed her nothing, and the more she tightened her grip, the more everything slipped away. The mansion had become a cage of suspicion, where every word was measured, every glance a potential betrayal, and through it all, Helena never dared to speak her suspicions aloud. She knew the storm was inside her family now, but to admit it would mean admitting she had raised traitors. Instead, she kept her silence, nursing her paranoia like a secret wound. What she didn't realize was that by refusing to name the enemy, she was letting the rot grow unchecked. And I, the silent daughter she had long forgotten, stood at the center of it all, watching her unravel piece by piece, knowing the war she feared was already being fought, not with armies, but with whispers, lies, and shadows that only I controlled. The breaking point came on a storm-drenched night when the wind howled through the estate and the rain lashed against the windows like a warning from the heavens themselves. Helena sat in her study, the fire casting jagged shadows across her face, her eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, her hands trembling as she scribbled in her private journal. She wrote not of triumphs or strategies, but of enemies. Adrian, Celeste, even the servants who had once sworn loyalty. The words looked less like plans and more like accusations, frantic scratches of a woman cornered by ghosts only she could see. That night, I watched as she summoned a messenger in secret, handing him letters sealed with her crest. I knew even before he left what those letters contained: orders to disinherit Adrian, to cut Celeste from the estate, to strip her children of the wealth she had once promised them. In her paranoia, Helena believed only by destroying them could she keep her power intact. Yet the irony was cruel. By writing those letters, she destroyed the last fragile thread binding her family together. Adrian discovered her plans first, stumbling drunkenly upon one of the drafts she had foolishly left on her desk. His rage was volcanic. He stormed into the hall, screaming that his own mother had betrayed him, his voice echoing through the mansion until the very walls seemed to shake. Celeste joined the chaos, her shrill accusations cutting through the air like knives, blaming Helena for every humiliation she had ever suffered. The fight that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, words so vile they could never be taken back. Helena, her face pale but defiant, stood at the top of the staircase, declaring herself still the queen of this house, her voice raw with desperation. But no one listened. Adrian cursed her name, Celeste spat at her feet, and the servants stood, watching with wide eyes, no longer afraid, only curious, as if waiting for the inevitable collapse. I lingered in the shadows, unseen, my heart steady, knowing this was the moment I had been waiting for. Helena's war was no longer against politicians or rivals. It was against her own blood. And in a war like that, there could be no victors, only ashes. The mansion had become a battlefield, its marble floors scarred with broken glass, and its halls heavy with the stench of hatred. Adrian, drunk and reckless, began openly plotting against Helena, whispering to creditors and rivals that he was willing to sell family secrets if they would help him seize what remained of the fortune. Celeste, humiliated and desperate, turned to the socialites who once adored her, feeding them stories about her mother's madness in exchange for scraps of attention. Helena sensed the rebellion tightening around her like a noose. Yet still, she clung to her crumbling throne, ordering guards to keep watch at her door, locking her jewels and ledgers away as though bolts and keys could protect her from the blood of her own children. But betrayal has no need of keys. One night, while thunder rolled outside and candles flickered low, Helena awoke to the sound of footsteps in her chamber. She sat up sharply, her breath quickening, her eyes darting toward the locked doors. But it was not a thief, nor an intruder, from outside. Adrian stood at the foot of her bed, his face shadowed, his breath laced with liquor, a dagger glinting faintly in his hand. For a moment, silence reigned between them, broken only by the storm beyond the windows. "You made me nothing," he slurred, voice low and venomous. "All my life you crowned yourself and crushed me under your heel. Tonight that ends." Helena's scream tore through the halls as Adrian lunged, but Celeste was faster than expected. Whether out of spite or self-preservation, she burst into the room, shrieking that Adrian would not take what was hers. The siblings collided, the dagger clattering across the floor as their fight devolved into a frenzy of fists and curses. Helena, trembling, crawled toward the weapon, her hands bleeding as she grasped the blade. For the first time in her life, she was not the predator, but the prey, cornered in her own kingdom, forced to fight her own blood for survival. I watched from the shadows, unseen but omnipresent, and I knew the end was drawing near. The house was no longer Helena's fortress. It was her coffin. And with every scream, every blow, every drop of blood on the floor, I felt the chains of invisibility break. My revenge was no longer a secret storm. It had become their reality. The storm outside roared like a beast, but the greater storm was inside the mansion. Adrian and Celeste clawed at each other, their screams echoing through the vast halls, curses sharper than blades. Helena clutched the dagger to her chest, her breath ragged, her once majestic figure hunched and trembling, the queen reduced to a cornered animal. Adrian broke free from Celeste's grasp, his face twisted with rage, his eyes red with drink and fury, and he lunged for his mother. But Helena's fear had birthed something darker, something primal. With a cry that was half sob, half roar, she drove the dagger forward, the blade sinking deep into Adrian's side. His eyes widened, not in anger but in shock, as he staggered, backward, blood spreading across his shirt like a blooming rose. Celeste shrieked, rushing to him, but her hands came back slick with crimson, her sobs echoing as Adrian collapsed against the cold marble floor. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Helena's hand shook as she released the dagger, her face pale, her lips quivering, her body trembling with the weight of what she had done. She looked at Adrian's still body, then at Celeste's. Tear-streaked face twisted with hatred, and in that moment, something inside her shattered completely. Celeste's scream cut through the silence like glass breaking. "You killed him. You killed your own son." Her voice carried down the corridors, pulling servants and guards to the scene, their eyes wide with horror as they saw the mighty Helena, drenched in her son's blood, clutching a weapon that still dripped red. The queen's mask had fallen. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch of power. She was a murderer, a mother who had slain her heir in a drunken storm of paranoia and rage. And as I watched from the shadows, my heart was calm. My lips curved in a smile. Helena had destroyed herself with her own hands. My vengeance was nearly complete. The mansion was chaos. Servants scattered like frightened birds, guards whispered behind closed doors, and the air smelled of iron and fear. Adrian's blood still stained the marble, a scar no amount of scrubbing could erase. Celeste, wild with grief and rage, stood before the gathered crowd of household eyes, pointing at Helena with trembling hands, screaming words that echoed like a curse. "She is no queen. She is a murderer. She killed her own son." Helena tried to speak, to command, to claw back the authority slipping through her fingers, but her voice cracked, her body trembled, and her words were swallowed by the murmurs of betrayal spreading like fire. I knew this was the moment I had waited for, the moment when shadows no longer served me. For years, I had moved silently, whispering poison, weaving lies, guiding every fracture until the walls caved in. But now, the time for whispers had ended. I stepped forward from the edge of the room, my presence alone silencing the chatter. Heads turned, eyes widened, because for so long I had been invisible. Just a quiet figure in the background, overlooked, dismissed, ignored. Helena's eyes locked onto mine, and in them I saw it. Recognition. She understood in a single heartbeat, though she could not speak it aloud. The color drained from her face, her lips parted, and for the first time in her reign, the great Helena looked afraid not of enemies, not of rivals, but of me, her own forgotten daughter. Celeste's sobs filled the silence. The servants watched with wide eyes, and I felt the weight of the moment settle like a crown upon my head. I had been the shadow. Now I was the storm. And Helena finally knew. The daughter she had buried in silence had risen to write the end of her empire. The great hall had never been so silent, the chandeliers above casting fractured light on a scene that felt more like a trial than a gathering. Helena stood trembling at the center, her crimson gown splattered with Adrian's blood, her once perfect hair falling loose, her eyes darting from servant to servant as though searching for a shred of loyalty. Celeste clung to her brother's body, weeping bitterly, her voice raw from screaming accusations. And then there was me, no longer hidden in the shadows, but standing in plain sight, my calm presence drawing every gaze like gravity itself. I walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, the sound of my heels echoing like a judge's gavel in the room of the condemned. Helena's lips parted, a whisper escaping them, so faint I almost smiled. "You." The word wasn't a question. It was recognition, heavy with all the years she had ignored me, dismissed me, belittled me, as if I were a ghost haunting her halls. But now the ghost had taken form. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the hall with a clarity that silenced even Celeste's sobs. "Me, the daughter you thought too quiet, too weak, too forgettable. The shadow at your table, the whisper in your halls. You never saw me, Helena, but I saw everything." A murmur rippled through the servants, the guards, the few remaining, allies who lingered at the edges of the chaos. Helena staggered back a step, her hand clutching the empty air as though she could hold on to the power already slipping away. "You poisoned them!" she spat, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "You turned them against me. You ruined everything I built." My lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "No, Mother. You did that yourself. I only held up the mirror." For a long, taut moment, neither of us moved. It was not a battle of swords, but of eyes, of wills, of two queens locked in silent war, but only one of us had an empire left to claim. The hall was alive with whispers, the kind that spread faster than fire, every servant and guard watching as if history itself was being written before their eyes. Helena stood there, shaking, her blood-stained gown clinging to her like a curse, her crown of fear gone, her aura of control shattered. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence was mine, the audience mine, even Celeste, crumpled beside Adrian's corpse, lifted, her tear-soaked face to listen. I stepped closer, my gaze locked on Helena, and spoke the words that carved the final cracks into her throne. You called yourself a queen, but queens build empires on loyalty, not chains. You built yours on greed, lies, and fear. And now, look at what remains. A son dead by your own hand, a daughter who spits at your feet, allies who have abandoned you, servants who no longer bow. Tell me, Helena, what are you now if not a woman stripped bare? My voice was calm, but each word landed like a lash. Murmurs grew into gasps, and I could see the faces of the onlookers shifting, not with pity, but with disgust, the kind reserved for tyrants who fall. Helena's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, her eyes wide, her lips trembling, but she had no answer. She tried to speak, tried to summon the venom that once commanded nations, but only a broken whisper escaped. This was mine. Not anymore, I cut in, my tone sharp as steel. I turned then, not toward her, but toward the gathered crowd. My gaze swept across them, steady, unflinching, claiming them without a crown, without jewels, without force. The age of Helena is over, I declared, my voice carrying like thunder through the hall. You can choose to cling to her dying shadow, or you can stand with me. The effect was immediate. Heads bowed, murmurs of agreement rose, and even the guards shifted their stances, subtly aligning with me instead of her. Helena's face crumpled as she realized what had happened. Her throne had not been stolen by armies, but by silence, patience, and the daughter she had never seen. Helena's scream tore through the hall, raw and jagged, a sound too primal for the woman who once controlled entire governments with a smile. She lunged forward, blood still dripping from her hands, her jeweled rings slick with crimson, her eyes wide like a hunted animal. The guests recoiled, some gasping, others laughing nervously, as if unable to believe that the mighty Helena, the Queen of Whispers, the Empress of Secrets, had been reduced to this. She clawed at her hair, tearing strands free, staggering across the marble floor as though the ground itself betrayed her. You think you can take it from me? She shrieked, her voice cracking. This is mine. Mine. I bled for it. I killed for it. I am it. Her words echoed, but no one stepped forward to support her. No allies, no sycophants, no trembling. Ministers to soothe her rage. Only silence. Only me. I did not move. I only watched. My stillness was her undoing. The more calm I remained, the more frenzied she became, until her own madness stripped her bare in front of the very court she once commanded. She grabbed a golden goblet from the banquet table and hurled it against the wall, the sound ringing like a death knell. She smashed plates, overturned chairs, scattering jeweled fruits and wine across the floor until the hall looked less like a palace and more like a battlefield of one woman's collapse. At last, she fell to her knees, her chest heaving, her once perfect gown torn and stained, her voice reduced to a broken rasp. Don't take it from me, please. It's all I have. And for the first time in my life, I saw Helena not as a queen, not as a monster, but as a woman stripped of her crown. Her beauty, her lies, nothing more than a fragile body kneeling in a pool of her own ruin. But pity is a luxury I no longer carried. The hall had fallen silent, save for Helena's ragged breaths, the echo of her collapse reverberating through the grand room like the toll of a funeral bell. Her trembling hands reached out, fingers grasping at the marble as though the cold stone could anchor her fading power. Her allies, once bound to her by fear and greed, stood frozen, unwilling to move, unwilling to touch her, as if she carried a plague no one dared to catch. I stepped forward, slow, deliberate, each click of my heel against the marble slicing the silence into sharper fragments. Her head lifted, eyes bloodshot, wild with desperation, and for the first time she looked at me, not as her quiet daughter, not as her shadow, but as her executioner. "You," she whispered, her voice thin and trembling. "It was you all along." I said nothing. Words were unnecessary. My silence was the blade that had gutted her empire, the poison that had seeped into her veins, the fire that had consumed the throne she worshipped. Around us, the guests began to murmur, their gazes shifting not to her but to me, recognizing in that moment who now held the power. Helena's empire had not been stolen by a rival, nor dismantled by her enemies. It had been undone by the daughter she never thought worthy of notice. She tried to rise, clutching at the edge of a table, but her strength failed her. She collapsed back to the ground, broken, trembling, her crown invisible yet shattered, lying in pieces only she could see. And in that instant, I chose her fate. Death would have been mercy. Death would have given her an ending too noble for the monster she had been. Instead, I turned my back to her, my voice calm, steady, final. Let her live. Let her remember every moment of what she's lost. Gasps rippled through the hall, but no one moved to help her. They understood. Helena would live, but not as a queen, not as a ruler, not even as a mother. She would live as a hollow woman in a mansion that no longer belonged to her, haunted by the ghost of her own downfall. And as I walked away, the weight of years lifted from my shoulders, replaced not with joy, not with sorrow, but with something sharper, cleaner, freedom. Helena had been untouchable. Now she was nothing.